The importance. Gatsy Rice is an Auburn woman who we all should know. She was from Auburn and was very successful and well-known. Gatsy Rice owned a lot of property and can read and write, which is highly unusual for a formerly enslaved person. Although she didn't have any rights, Gatsy was still extremely successful. Most importantly, she acted as an inspiration for newly freed African-American women in the South. What were her contributions? Well, Gatsy owned a lot of property in present-day downtown Auburn. She owned a boarding house for cadets and a shop where she was a seamstress and a hat maker. She also owned 2 houses, one in Auburn and one in Opelika, and a sizable amount of land in Tuskegee. She gave her land to her son and daughter, who later sold it at an auction. What was her early life, her job, and what was known of her family? Though her exact birth date is unknown, Gatsy Rice was born around 1832. She lived in Auburn, Alabama as an enslaved person and a nanny for Alicia Milton, which likely consisted of a vigorous lifestyle. While she was enslaved, Gatsy was expected to follow orders with no complaints, and her freedom of movement and choices of activities were most likely restricted. She was probably not free to express her own opinions while she was serving her mistress. Though she was not formally educated, she had multiple jobs, including a seamstress and a hat maker. She helped start a boarding house for students where she would cook and clean for them. Because Gatsy was able to accomplish all this without formal education, we can conclude that she was highly intelligent. She also owned almost 250 acres of land in Macon County, which again was unusual for a formerly enslaved woman. By owning a business and managing properties, we are able to see her hard work ethic and strategic mind through her legacy as a successful black woman. Before 1880, her husband passed away, and she was known as the widow. Gatsy's children, Nancy and Willie, inherited her land after her death in 1896. Pine Hill Cemetery. Pine Hill Cemetery was an all-white cemetery during the 1830s and all the way through the 1960s. However, some African Americans were buried there, Gatsy being one of them. This didn't happen often, and when it did, it was when they were enslaved, buried on the outskirts of the cemetery. But Gatsy asked to be buried there after Baptist Hill was built, Baptist Hill being an African American cemetery. Now, why was she buried in Pine Hill instead? We like to believe that she wanted to be buried near her husband, who died before her, and to be nearer to enslaved persons that had passed away and was buried without markers. That brings us to Gatsy Rice being the only African American to be buried with the marker in Pine Hill Cemetery. This also creates the idea that she was seen as more than just an enslaved person to others in the community, and her request to have her accomplishments recognized by a marker backs this idea. Who was Gatsy Rice as a person? Well, from this historical evidence, we can say that Gatsy Rice was devoted to her husband, as she became known as the widow. Gatsy was also family-oriented, as she had accumulated a lot of land, a very large amount of land, which was quite the achievement given her circumstances, and gave her property to her children. From this, we can say that Gatsy was overall a loving and caring person who put others' needs before her own. An example of this is when she was managing a boarding house to take care of all those kids. We can also assume that she was very intelligent, as managing to acquire the amount of land that she did during the time was not an easy feat. And her creation of will sheltered her investment in the future generations. Her story is inspirational because Gatsy was born at a double disadvantage, being black and being a woman during that time period. But she still managed to be free of slavery and started her own business. This teaches the youth that despite their upbringings or wherever they came from or were born from, they can achieve great things. It inspired me because, as a black person, I can understand her feelings of being born at a disadvantage because of our skin color. But I have my own skills and talents to pursue my goals with help from God and Jesus.